Alright, so we're on a mission here to do some Spring with our web services and now Hibernate in this video we're doing today. So let me see, here's a picture. Okay, this is essentially what we're trying to do. Well, actually that's not exactly right either, is it? Let's see. I did have one here that I just did. Let's see. Alright, close this and we'll go find it. Okay, so essentially we started out with the center part here. We created a secure token server, we generated all our keys, and we have a web service consumer and we have a web service provider, and we got all that working using some dummy code where we were just saying give me a user, and we were hard coding the user and passing it back. So basically the consumer goes to the STS, gets a token, calls the web service validates, through the STS that the token's valid, returns the data back to the consumer, and it's all using SAML tokens and encrypted messages. So that's all really cool, but we needed to do something really useful. So in the last video, the first thing we did was stick Spring into our secure token service so that we could use Spring Security to do LDAP authentication. So we can authenticate the client via an Apache DS LDAP server sitting on a VM somewhere. Okay, and we got that working, and that's all dandy. So we're one step closer to being almost a production-like thing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to finish it up by implementing Spring and Hibernate in our web services. So we're actually going to go read an Oracle 11g database, which is actually sitting on the same VM as Apache DS, by the way, and get some data back from it and push that model, the domain model, back to the client, and then the client can print out data from the model. So that's essentially what we're doing. And this is a picture of what was going on as far as doing the security with the web services. So if we go and look at our database, here's our this is the record we're going to be passing back and forth, or well, back to the client. And it's basically just a user record. It has user information. So if we were going to create an account in this fictitious application, it would be this user, and we could make a call, say give me a list of users, or give me this user, that kind of stuff. So, and we're going to do it with secure web services. Okay, so when we did our secure web services and we implemented Spring so that we could start defining our web services with Spring, it was just an easier way to do it that way, rather than every time we create a new service we have to come into WebXML and add a new servlet and a new mapping, and then add stuff to this Sun JAX WS XML, add the endpoints there. So by doing it with Spring, we've cut down a little bit of the config work. So now we have an application context, we have a context loader in Spring. So Spring fires up, loads our config file. Okay, and here we defined a few extra lines so we could get our web services defined using Spring, and we did that here in the last video. So now what we're going to do is add some more stuff to the config file. Okay, we got some JDBC properties. Okay, this is going to have all the configuration stuff we need. We're using the Oracle 10G dialect. We got our Oracle driver. Okay, so you'll see we also updated our libraries here. Now after we put in Spring, we're using the Oracle JDBC drivers. We have our connection pooling libraries. We also have, I guess I should take that out of here since that's a newer one. And then we also have the Hibernate JPA that comes with NetBeans. We added that. The commons and the JDBC driver and the pools and JAX WS Spring, this is custom stuff that I went over in the last videos for this. But for this video we need the JDBC6 drivers and the connection pooling. Okay, I'm going to have to fix that, make sure I take one of these out. So But anyway, I tested it and it does work. I guess at this point I'm not sure which connection pool it's using, 1.2 or 1.3. Depends on which order they're getting pushed in there. So, but we're going to just move on. So our application context is defining our JDBC properties, and then once those properties get loaded by the property configurer, we can then use them here as like this to set the values that we're going to need for our data source. So we have the driver class name in the properties. That would be here. So we can use Hibernate connection driver class name, but we would specify it as the jdbc.url and then jdbc.username and jdbc.password in our JDBC properties, and these are the values here. And for the other ones we would use the actual Hibernate values, but we're not using any of those here. Now we could do it here. Well, actually we are right here, Hibernate dialect. Okay, so that's how you would use them, by using the configurer properties. Okay, so we're setting up our data source. So once our data source bean is created, we can then set up a Hibernate session factory. And then the session factory takes the data source as one of its properties along with a config location. Okay, in this case we're defining our models in the Hibernate config file. So let's go take a look at that. And that's really all we have to do. So every one of our models, our domain models, is defined here. And the rest of our properties are coming from the properties file. And so now we have Hibernate session factories. Okay, so the next thing we have to do now is create our DAOs. So we have DAO beans, and we're going to look at these in a minute, and this is how we define our DAOs. And our DAO takes a session factory. So you see the chaining here is data source passed into a session factory passed into our data access objects, and data access objects will now be passed in to our web services that we're using Spring to define. So you see the method to the madness here. We created Spring so we could define our web services, but the plus side is now we can also use Spring to inject our data access objects, which is what we want to do. Okay, so now that we have our configuration all laid out, we can take a look. So now I'm a big AppFuse user, and I've basically stole a lot of this right from the AppFuse code that I've done with an AppFuse application. So I have a generic DAO. It's using generics, and we have types and keys, so that and it's defining some simple methods here, things that you would normally want to do with a domain model. Okay, and our user DAO is going to extend that generic DAO, and it's going to tell it, well, we're using this user model. This is where the generics come into play, and the key to that user model is a long. Okay, and then of course we're going to define some extra methods here that we're going to want to use, like find user by email, find by user ID. These aren't defined in the generic DAO. And now here's our generic DAO Hibernate, which is also using generics. And we're going to define this in the same fashion. We're going to pass it a model and a key type, and we're going to implement that generic DAO. And when we extend it from here, we'll be able to tie all this together. So you see here is where we're setting our persistent class, and here is where we're setting up our session factory attributes and our Hibernate templates, and how we're getting access to these things by having them injected into our beans from here. So here is where our DAO is getting the session factory, and it's setting that property. I believe there's a session factory property here. Yep, so here's where we're getting our session factory. Okay, so now when we extend it, we're going to extend our generic DAO. We're telling it we're using the user and a long, and we're going to implement the user DAO, which extends the generic DAO. So it all comes back tied together through here. And now we have methods we can use to call against Hibernate session and our template to get records and save records and such. So in this particular one, this is the only method I think we're using here as the example. Okay, and then of course here's the user model that we're talking about. Now it's defined using the Hibernate annotations. I think they're more JPA-ish. here is where we're defining our entity types and the annotations we're going to use to define this model. Okay, so it's the user model. Now the tricky part here is the sequence generator. Since we're using an Oracle database, Oracle doesn't have doesn't do it the same way that a lot of the other ones do it. Like MySQL, for example, you have the auto increment concept. With Oracle, you got to use a sequence generator, but fortunately Hibernate knows about it, and we can define a sequence to Hibernate and tell it, like for you to get the next key, you have to get it from that sequence. Okay, so here we define our ID. It's a generated value. It's generated by using a sequence, and here's the key. It's called ID. And our app table, if we go look at our table, we have an ID field, and that is our sequence field. Okay, and these are all the other field names, the column names in the table: username, password, password hint, first name, last name, and such are all in the field in the table we're creating. So website. So for each getter, we define our columns and our column attributes, and then we also have a set of getters and setters for all of these. Now you notice full name here is transient because there isn't really a full name field. We're building it on the fly by the user. So we're telling it that this isn't a database field. This isn't transient. It's not getting serialized. So, and then the rest of these, of course, they are. And because our base object is going to require, we have our own base object here, by the way, which is here, and it requires you to have a toString, a Boolean, and a hash code. So that's why we have those in our user model. So we created our equals and our hash code and our toString, and we're also using the toString builder from Apache Commons here. So now that once all of this is set up, okay, now we should be able to have all of this, have the DAO injected into our service. So if we go look at our service, when we created our service, what we did was, since we're telling it, it's a constructor arg here, in our service we have a constructor arg, and the argument is the user DAO. That's what we're passing into our user manager. So we have a private field, which is our user DAO. Our constructor takes the user DAO, and then when Spring instantiates our object, it gives us an instance of this user DAO. And now when our client calls get user by name, we can use the user DAO to say go find by user ID. And the generic DAO Hibernate does a find by user ID, and it's running this query on the domain model, and Hibernate knows that this is our model because we defined it here in our config. Okay, so that's more or less how it all ties together. And then so we build this, and then we deploy it, and then when we go look at our client, our new client now, is basically getting the user manager service, getting the port, calling get user by name, passing it one of the user IDs that's in our table. Hopefully I spelled it right. So we have some users in here and their user IDs, and one of them happens to be me, I believe. Yes. So now when we run this, we're going to run that DAO Hibernate code, and it's going to go run the query, get the user, and pass the user model, which is this is our domain model that we have in our web service, and it's just going to pass this back, and we can call methods on it. Okay, so well, let's do it. So there we go. So what we did here is we demonstrated how to implement Hibernate in our web services so that we can actually do something useful. I will eventually have all this code uploaded somewhere. I'm going to probably just create another Google project for this and make it available on the web soon. So hope it helps.